Our next presenter is David Kazdan, AD8Y. He's going to talk to us about 3 time-of-flight measurement projects on a common hardware platform.
Thank you. Greetings all. I will get the microphone and queue up for the camera. My slides are coming. What we have today is, excuse me. What we have today is a tale of 3 electrical engineering undergraduate senior projects. They all involve time-of-flight problems for radio measurements. We hope in service to measurement of the ionosphere, sounding the ionosphere, and in particular for the 2024 eclipse. So everybody get ready for the 2024 eclipse. The project is been run by John Gibbons, who spoke, by Christina Collins, who spoke, by me, and it has been supported with the kind financial support of AMPER. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. So, 3 time-of-flight ionospheric sounding systems based on a common hardware platform. Spoiler, I'm going to talk about it in some detail, but the common hardware platform really only has 2 components. The Teensy, which is a high-speed version of an Arduino. I'm assuming to this crowd I don't need to elaborate on what the microcontroller Arduino platform is about, but this one is fast enough to do accurate analog sampling of the signals right off the speaker connections from the shortwave radios, and maybe even at low-frequency RF. The further spoiler, like everything else that's going on at HamSCI, is that the timing of this is controlled by the GPS constellation. And in particular, here, the 1 pulse per second signals that come off a GPS receiver that have this really just remarkable property of being able to provide knowledge anywhere of the time of launch of a signal from WWV. So you step back from that scene, it's amazing that you can do that. And we'll talk briefly about how this was solved in the pre-GPS era, in particular with the LORAN navigation system. So, most of you went through engineering curricula. Most of you experienced senior project. These are simultaneously dreaded by undergrads and very much anticipated with enthusiasm. It's the great capstone of an electrical engineering undergraduate curriculum. The students set up very involved projects. They work hard at them. Funding is at best limited. Faculty support through its own funding is perhaps also at best limited. So the Case Amateur Radio Club has sponsored quite a number of senior projects over the past 5 or 6 years, and many of them have been quite successful. The club has used some of its own funds. We've garnered some alumni donation for such things. And we finally decided this year we were going to use a different model. We asked ARDC if they would fund a pilot study in external funding of amateur radio and radio science related projects. And we set up a different model for the students proposing the projects, meaning here actually we proposed the projects. Now, we had a couple that we had been working on for several years, already had some good results, and we could package for the undergraduates something reasonable that they could do over the 12 weeks of the project. It's a very tight time constraint for them while they're taking other classes. So I'll talk about the 3 that are going on right now. They are all radar of opportunity sorts of projects. WWVB, the second ticks from WWV and WWVH, and one that perhaps the crowd here is less familiar with, the 1970s attempt at coherent CW, a time-precise radio telegraphy. So, start with the first one. Excuse me, we all like listening to WWV. We all like listening to WWV, okay. Less so WWVB. The programming isn't as interesting, the tones aren't presented quite as loudly, and it is in the old iron low frequency range. It's the United States 60 kilohertz station that sets all of the atomic clocks that you can buy cheaply at Walmart. The signal that's sent on it is amplitude modulated. There is a second phase modulated signal superimposed on the amplitude modulated one. That's not our concern here. But the old AM signal uses a 1960s military timecoding called the Inter-Range Instrumentation Group timecode. This was for transmitting accurate time signals, as I understand it, and Michael, correct me if need be, for ballistic missile testing programs across various military ranges. version H of it is used by WWV. It's a 1-minute code with 1 flag of data per second. It's not exactly a bit because it can have 3 different states, so 1 flag per second. And the way that they are flagged is by length of the signal's downtime and uptime, key up, key down. It provides an interesting, not quite random pattern, but at least interestingly pseudo-random pattern to use matched filtering against, because you can generate a template locally. So I thought this version of it from WWV and WWVH would be easier to present visually because it's in nice glaring colors, but you can see that in 10-second blocks, there are data bits sent, and each block is marked off by a framing flag. So you know ahead of time what you're going to get. I mean, if you're trying to set your clock, then presumably you don't know ahead of time. But if you're getting your time from a GPS receiver or from an already set clock or from the internet, then you can map out ahead of time what the pattern is going to be. And the notion of a correlation here, which has been talked about in other contexts in these meetings, is that you prepare the template, you receive the data. After you've received the data, you start sliding the template around to see where you get the best match, and then read off the position of the template as the maximum likelihood indicator of the delay. So our radar signal of opportunity here is the timecode itself from WWVB, and you get to use all of each minute if you want to integrate the maximum likelihood indication of the time delay over 1 minute. You can use less of it with less precision if you want finer time granularity. NIST itself has a delivery to consumer interest in knowing what signal strengths are like out in the distance, at least over the United States, their market base. And NIST is interested, which in these terms mean, yeah, Mike and I have talked about this a little bit, in perhaps having a deployable device. And yeah, we hope maybe by the end of calendar year, we will have something that can be experimentally distributed across some interesting spots in the United States. And I will point out, an AUB, the usual suspect, has made measurements of these, and that's a click to his website on the topic. They do have a lot of, this student group does have a lot of it working already. They don't have data. Next time, we will present data. The time after that, we will present eclipse data. We like eclipses. Okay, project 2. We have another radar signal of opportunity. This one's from WWV and WWVH. The second tick is a nicely guarded AM signal, which means that it exists independently in spectrum space from the carrier. That at WWV is 5 cycles exactly of 1,000 hertz modulated signal, so 1,000 hertz away from the carrier. WWVH, it's 1,200. It's far enough away that we can filter it fairly well. Maybe you guys can separate it a little more. Yeah, maybe not. And we will use then the 1 pulse per second rising edge from the GPS receiver to mark off locally exactly what time the second tick launched, and again use an autocorrelation to see what the maximum likelihood was of the delay. Now, this is maybe the modern version of how Galileo started in on medical measurements. This has nothing whatsoever to do with HamSCI or anything else we're talking about, but it really was too good to leave out. Galileo actually went through, and one of his colleagues went through a number of prototype and manufacturing development systems for pendulums for measuring pulse rate. So, you know, make sure that when you go to the doc next, you get your pulse measured accurately with a pulsilogium. See what you learn at HamSCI. Yeah. Okay, so back to the second ticks. Matt and RGT is kind enough to look after these at his secondary station, which of course has the call sign of WWV. Back in LORAN times, the timing could only be determined differentially. The stations themselves were at well-surveyed distances from each other, set their timing relative to each other with a primary station, secondary station method. So in some sense, we're recreating the LORAN network by having the recreated time of flight, the recreated origin of flight time from the GPS constellation measuring, in some sense, our hyperbola of position from WWV that way. And yeah, I am glancing at the clock. So this one, actually, we have some results. From the first set of data, first light on this, we just put it into an Excel spreadsheet, separated off about 2 minutes of data here. Matt said that he had, when I rather excitedly sent these to Matt at WWV, he said, yeah, he used to have a rag carpet that looked like this. But you can see the left-hand edge here represents the GPS tick. So this is presumably the time of launch of the second tick from Colorado. We have the irreducible delay. You know, 186,000 miles per second. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. So we have an irreducible delay in Cleveland, Ohio. It's not going to get any shorter than about here, about 7.5 milliseconds. And then these are the 5 ticks running along in time. So the squiggle at front that extends farther to the right, and one in the middle, and then one in the back that I think got suppressed, those are the top of minute markers. The same 1,000 hertz signal gets extended for a period of time that I'm blanking on, actually, but long enough to go all the way to the right on this, and it was reassuring to see that, to have some notion that the system was working pretty well. Presented differently, here's an entire UTC day of such a signal. This is in heat map form. So the UTC day begins top left of this, the hours run down, each individual second tick runs across. The full second would go quite far to the right, out to the street someplace. We're only recording about 50 milliseconds here. But even from this, you can see that we in fact are seeing time of flight differences and certainly propagation quality differences. This is 15 megahertz, pretty close to the amateur 20 meter band. So the sun up in Cleveland, Ohio is here, 20 meter band opened up. It had some varying fortunes during daylight hours. Sometimes it was propagating well, sometimes it was propagating not so well. And you can see that the ticks don't line up perfectly vertically everywhere here. Those are the propagation delays. For some of the times that the signal was strong, you can see the minute streaks going all the way across. During local night, there's nothing here, and in fact, even noise on the band went down pretty well. These are from the evening before. 15 megahertz propagation extended pretty far after sunset that day. And I've circled a detail of it. You can see how much lateral squiggle there is, indicating propagation, indicating, we think, propagation changes and time of flight changes. This one is interesting. It was a slightly different recording technique. I didn't have the receiver's automatic gain control off. So the noise got exaggerated during the time of no propagation. The receiver turned its gain up as far as it could, and this is just noise. But here, this is pretty comparable to what you saw before, except that it's in the midst of a good coronal mass ejection. And you can see this is like something from an old-fashioned television set where we control the horizontal, except we don't control it very well. So there are quite a number of squiggles here. I do have recordings from last week's event, which I think maybe wasn't quite as dramatic as the Space Weather Woman had promised that it would be. But nonetheless, we do have some good recordings from it. And if you send me an email, then I'll give you access to our database, and you can take a look at those. I didn't put them in the slide set here. Next time, keep your promises. So, yeah, okay. Did you have a comment to that? No, we do not. Okay. So anyway, we would really like to have this running well and broadly deployed by the eclipse. So, you know, HamSCI, we like eclipses. This is going to be the big one. Cleveland's in totality. We paid well for that. So this is going to be our moment in the sun, our moment not in the sun, something like that. All right, the third one, this is the one that I like myself, really. Coherent CW. Mid-70s, when I was a fairly new ham, Ray Petty published in QST, Coherent CW. It was on-off telegraphy on sharp timing edges from a crystal oscillator in his case. Microprocessors weren't much available. He did all of this in raw CMOS and analog filters, and I gave him a lot of credit for getting this to work. It was the first effort to turn radio telegraphy into a Shannon information theory style digital mode. And in fact, one of our past club presidents, Rachel Bodeker, pointed out to me that Shannon wrote about this in his original paper in Bell System Journal in '47. So, okay, 20 or 30 years later, we actually got around to doing it. And it worked just remarkably well. He used an integrate and dump technique, so basically a matched filter method to decode Morse elements out of the noise on the assumption that both transmitting and receiving side were on accurate timing and on accurate phasing. The remarkable part was the phasing had to be done manually. So why does this work at all? It's because there is a genuine definition of the radio telegraph code. It's amazing that the United Nations has nothing better to do with its time than to set such definitions, but their 1992 most recent definition really is entertaining reading. It was a favor to amateur radio operators to add the @ sign, the arrow base, to Morse code so that email addresses could be more conveniently sent in radio telegraphy. Who knew? So the ITU definition has a strict definition, and as long as that's standardized, kind of like highway road signs, the whole system can work well. So reception isn't really that hard to automate. And any of you who have used FLDigi or the programs like that know you can fairly well decode at least machine-sent Morse. Hand-sent Morse is pretty hard, and it's amazing that a good CW operator can do it. But the problem here is that it isn't really either a synchronous code or asynchronous. You don't know what the speed is going to be. You don't know what the phasing of the characters is. And the synchronization solves this. So the framing, the phasing problem is hard. This was Petty's original version of it, and the receiving operator would have his hand on the timing knob, the one in the lower right there, as a series of dits was sent over about a minute. But once that had been done, this is like the Morse code version of FT8. It's really great, and it's a very nonlinear filtering system. So eventually, there just is no noise in the system if this is working at all. You hear velvet silence against audio oscillator Morse code. Well, if you do it with accurate timing from quartz crystals or from GPS receivers, it becomes a much easier problem to solve. So why isn't this everywhere? And the interesting answer is it was a regulatory issue. Early on-off telegraphy and 5-bit baud were the only permitted digital coding systems on the amateur bands. And this came up as a result of that. Then PSK31 showed up. Prometheus Unbound, really, QST? Okay. But it was so popular that the FCC changed the regulatory surround of it. PSK31 took over that end of digital, and there really wasn't a lot of ham radio societal need anymore for coherent CW. But we have good reasons to restart it. Most amateur radio operators have technician licenses, and an incredible number of them want to participate in HamSCI stuff. So we have to give them a way of doing on-off telegraphy. They're permitted it on 80, 40, and 15 meters. Not all of them really want to spend a lot of time learning Morse code. So this is what turns it into a keyboard-to-keyboard mode, and we have done it. We've had what we think is history's first NIST traceable GPS-controlled coherent CW reception over a long distance, Philadelphia to Cleveland on 40 meters, and contact over a short distance. So one of our new technicians involved in this project got his first contact certificate with a CW contact done in GPS-controlled coherent CW. So this is cool. The board that John designed for it is a nice, neat thing with a Teensy microcontroller, a GPS receiver, and a bus for Raspberry Pi. It has proved to be a nice general purpose platform for these kinds of timing problems, and I commend it to all of you. We will work on making this available. Schematic for it indicates mostly that it's pretty simple, really, but he did a nice job with the board. Thanks, John. The code for this is not complicated. In particular, if you've never done interrupt programming before, there isn't anything terribly complicated to it. Got to get your variable declarations right. You have to, in fact, declare a subroutine that handles the hardware interrupt, and then your code can do what you want. You have accurate timing edges. You got to do that in the Teensy, though. The Raspberry Pi, with all of its operating system overhead, isn't nearly accurate enough to do those kinds of precise timing problems. Okay, so get ready for the eclipse, everybody. We've got work to do. I have not heard enough about planning for the eclipse. It's only 2 years distant at this point. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to HamSCI. Thanks to my collaborators here. Thanks to Amper. Questions? Thank you.